Welcome back to the 2022 APAICS Tech Summit and our last panel of the day, Ethical Frameworks for Technology. This session will explore how we can advance technology while ensuring that it is still used in ways that respect civil rights, preserve privacy, ensure transparency, and hold both governments and companies accountable. Moderating this discussion is Shreya Singh Hernandez. Shreya, who's also an APAICS alumna, is a data and tech equity subject matter expert focused on social impact. She is currently working at the Aspen Institute as Aspen Digital's Tech Equity Research Manager on the Tech Equity Accountability Mechanism, otherwise known as TEAM. In this role, she works at the intersection of tech, policy, and justice for underrepresented communities. TEAM partners with leaders and academics in the digital technology sector to standardize diversity, equity, and inclusion data collection, and provides expert support from diversifying pathways in tech employment to product impact to hold the tech industry as a whole accountable. Welcome back to APAICS, Shreya.
Thank you so much, Madeline. It is my honor to be moderating today's panel on tech equity and ethical frameworks. It is also my pleasure to be in community with our brilliant panelists today. Today, we will be hearing from the following panelists. Arnab Chakraborty is Accenture's North America Applied Intelligence Lead, where he plays a key role in driving collaboration with AI startups and ecosystem partners, along with academic and research institutions to bring AI-led innovation to clients. Arnab is also on the advisory board of UC Berkeley's Institute of Data Science and Stanford Institute of Computational Math and Engineering. Emily Chi is the Director of Telecommunications, Technology, and Media at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, or AAJC, where she is responsible for developing and providing public policy, research, strategies, analysis, and education on telecommunications, technology, and media diversity. Daniel Kelly is the Director of Strategy and Operations at the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, Center for Technology and Society, CTS. CTS works through research and advocacy to fight for justice and fair treatment for all in digital social spaces, from social media to online games and beyond. Daniel leads the center's work to fight hate and harassment in the games. To kick off our conversation today, I'd love to ask our panelists a question about how does your organization think about ethical frameworks for new and emerging technologies, and what are the opportunities you have identified? At the Aspen Institute, we're looking at a digital equity accelerator to issues of privacy, internet governance, and algorithm accountability, to national security issues and how they intersect with artificial intelligence. I'd love to open this question up to any of our panelists to talk about how their organizations think about ethical frameworks for new and emerging technologies.
Yeah, I can pick it up here. Great to be in this panel with all of you. Just to give some background, at Accenture, especially with AI, we are seeing this as a huge alpha trend, in terms of how it's going to transform businesses and communities that we live in. And, I'm personally working with a number of CEOs and C-suites in, helping them how AI can transform their organizations. We are working on interesting topics like, creating, treatments for cancer, using the power of AI and algorithms. We are working on wildfire mitigation strategies, for utility companies, using machine vision. We're working on, areas like human trafficking and how to mitigate the risks of human trafficking, using the power of data analytics and AI. So huge opportunities, across the spectrum from business to social impact. Having said that, a big challenge that organizations face in this journey is around adoption. And that is centering around trust and integrity of the AI solutions. The latest research that we published around our tech research, tech vision, we call it, it actually pointed out that 65% of the consumers actually don't trust the AI solutions. And that to me indicates that we as the leadership, in this community have to take a very active role in creating responsible AI solutions, that go into the organizations and impacts our community. And as I look at that, there is a lot of regulations that are coming in, both in Europe as well as in US and North America. And when we did a pretty pioneering research with MIT around the whole AI maturity that is happening across the globe, and more importantly in the United States. And what we found that 97% of the leaders are aware of the regulations that are coming, but 6% of them believe that their organizations are ready, for taking care of the ongoing changes that are happening around AI regulation. And to me, that indicates that there are few things that organizations need to pay attention, when it comes to, doing AI in a responsible manner. Number one, it starts with principles and making sure that you have the right governance, clearly articulated around responsible AI. Very, very important, so that it's well understood across the organization. The second thing that is very important around that is to have the right policies and controls for risk mitigation, risk management across the entire data and AI value chain, if you will, right from the data to the algorithms to the insight creation and to the decision making. And then finally, it boils down to what kind of technology enablers we have put in place to ensure fairness, explainability of the algorithms, so that we can take care of the biases that can come in either in the data or the algorithm, and helps drive better accountability. And finally, it boils down to the talent. How do we make sure that we are having the right talent and the culture inbuilt who can speak the same language, understand how responsible AI can be actioned upon in their roles and within their organization and their teams. So those are, some of the areas that we are working on to really help organizations scale AI, but do that with confidence and do that by building trust in their entire ecosystem.
Yes, thank you so much, Arnab. I really appreciate your answer here and to hear more about the work that you're doing at Accenture. I would love to also ask our second question, which is, what are some of the challenges our panelists have seen in terms of managing/mitigating bias, harassment, and surveillance? I would love to pose this to Emily and Daniel to ask about your experiences.
Sure. Thank you so much, Shreya, and thank you so much to APAICS for arranging this panel to talk about how all these issues are affecting our community today. So I'm Emily Chi. I use she, her pronouns, and we're really at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, are trying to think about these issues specifically from an Asian American community lens. So some of the things that we're looking at, first of all, I just want to say all the issues that we're seeing with tech, with bias, surveillance, harassment, none of these issues are new, right? If you look at history, these are issues that have always existed in our society. So the tech edition is just amplifying what was already existing and has continued and perpetuated throughout our history. So, for example, when we think about discrimination against Asian Americans, the same way in real life you might discriminate against an Asian American sounding last name, maybe, or someone who attended an Asian university. Our algorithms that we're building to process those more quickly are using the same discriminatory biases that people already have, right? The machines aren't changing anything. They're informed and built by people who are biased. So of course the outcomes are going to be biased if we don't have corrective measures in them. So we always want to think about, how do we understand the community, their history, their interactions with the world, the way they have or do not have power and resources, instead of just jumping to the tech platform product features and thinking of it just as a technical issue. So really, people first, people centered is the first issue we see where it's not being done, and that's why we see a lot of misunderstanding and exclusion of our communities. Second, I'd say documentation of the issues and even, what the data looks like is already biased and discriminatory, right? Because that's also embedded in history, right? Even looking back at the census throughout history or other studies about health outcomes, about access to digital connections, all of these, it matters who is collecting, who they consider to be important and worth collecting data on, and who they know, right? So when we think about who in our population often gets erased by some of the mainstream studies, it's non-English speakers, because surveys and other studies often aren't conducted in other languages. Folks who may be differently documented, who are afraid to speak up or participate in such activities because they know they're at risk of being known. So, their data really isn't there because they're not willing to give it. But that essentially is erasing them from our analysis, even though they're one of the most vulnerable communities that we should be extra mindful of when we're designing and thinking about new products. So really, we need to think like, who has even the power and access to show up in the data, right? Like, who collected it and who is sometimes intentionally missing? And how do we reinsert those voices and those metrics when they are vulnerable and fearful and have reason not to trust these institutions, right? So it's cultural, it's relationship building, it's trust building, but also understanding the past and the context they're living in today. I'll also add that when we do win fights for greater privacy and digital rights, one of the challenges is that unfortunately, in our country, even with digital rights, it is an exercise. It's only exercisable by the most privileged, the most educated, people with the greatest resources and time to even understand and go through, those cookie banners and the privacy policies to opt out. It requires a great amount of resources and privileges. So our challenge is, even if we pass privacy legislation, how do we make sure it's accessible and exercisable by the most vulnerable communities with the least digital literacy, with the least education, with the least language access, right? So that's a challenge. And then the other thing I'll mention that I just need to re-highlight is our communities are so diverse. With every wave of immigration, every new country of origin, every new conflict that pushes refugees here, all the different languages that are spoken, all our different histories, we've been at war with each other for thousands of years sometimes in the motherland, and then we come here and we're all in the same group. We don't have the same understanding of history. We didn't all have the same Asian American experience. So it's really important to remember we're not a monolith and we're talking data. We really make sure we're inclusive and meaningfully representing the communities to make sure we are reducing harm against them and maximizing the potential good that we can do for them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. That was such a wonderful and insightful intersectional analysis and really took a look at the structures of power in play here. I'd love to hand it over to Daniel to talk a little bit about his work and his view of the challenges in managing and mitigating harm, bias, harassment in surveillance.
Sure, thank you, and thanks for having me on this panel. I'm in total agreement with everything that Emily is saying. I'm going to speak a little bit from our perspective at the Anti-Defamation League. Our mission is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment for all. And at the Center for Technology and Society, where I work, we're really focused on the second part of that mission, and focused on that in digital spaces, focusing on social media, focusing on online games, and sort of the two areas where we really focus and where we see there being two platform-wide problems, right? When you're thinking at the platform level, is we don't know how much hate there is anywhere on any platform. And we don't know whether anything any platform is doing at all is working, right? These seem like pretty fundamental concepts, right? To know how much of a thing is happening on your social platform and whether the things that you're doing to try to mitigate that harm are working. You might imagine that in the year 2022, having been through what the U.S. has been through, what other countries have been through, what social media has been through in terms of the sort of lack of faith that the public has in their ability to mitigate these problems, you think that we'd have a better handle on these kinds of issues, but we really don't. And so I think those are really, in terms of the amount, I think one of the things that we recommend and that we are pushing platforms to do, in terms of hate on any platform, you have platforms, social media companies that provide transparency reporting that is very, they sort of cherry pick the metrics. They don't, they change everything from quarter to quarter. We don't have a sense of whether, the data that they're providing us is accurate. And especially when we're talking about hate and harassment against vulnerable and marginalized communities, we don't have a sense, for example, how much hate against Asian Americans is there on Facebook, right? How much anti-Semitism is there on Twitter? Right? We don't have a sense of the experience of different communities on different platforms because the experience of hate as experienced by different communities is different, right? And so I think one of the things we talk about is that the platforms don't have their arms around centering the different communities and the ways that they're impacted by hate on their platforms. And that's one of the things we're pushing for in the work that we do. In terms of the efforts that the companies are making, again, we see high-minded, big. I think we see that less recently, but definitely in the past, we've seen sort of high, profile announcements from various companies about the actions that they're taking around extremism or hate or anti-Asian hate or anti-Semitism. And I think a lot of these times these things happen at the policy level, right? They happen at the level of the rules that are put in place in terms of how a platform is governed. But then when you actually look at and test whether the platform is enforcing these stated policies, I think you end up seeing huge gaps in the ways in which these things are enforced. And I think that goes back to what Emily was saying in terms of whose perspective is being included in the enforcement and in the interpretation of the policies. Are the perspectives of vulnerable and marginalized and targeted communities being centered in how the idea of hate is being interpreted in the policy making, in the enforcement, in content moderation decisions. So I think those are some of the sort of the big picture challenges that we see, and I'm certainly happy to get into some of the solutions such as they are, right, in what follows. But that's sort of what I'll highlight at a high level.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel. What really resonated with me was your point on the lack of unified systems or standards around addressing hate online across platforms, and the difference between the way different communities experience, and as Emily mentioned, even within the AAPI community, different sections of our community experience hate online. So thank you so much for that. And you've teed us up perfectly for our next question, which is, what are some solutions to the challenges we've just identified from your perspective? And how do we make sure that vulnerable communities do not bear the brunt of harms applied by new technologies? I'd love to open it up to our panelists here.
Yeah, no, Shreya, that's a great question. I am happy to pick it up here. I think I really love the comments made by Emily and Daniel, around the challenges. And as we look at, organizations, I think this is a huge responsibility for organizations that are bringing, AI-powered solutions to make sure that they are fair and, they are creating equitable decisions, right, for all cross sections of our society. I think it boils down to those 4 pillars that I mentioned, but our ability to, assess the maturity around the pillars, right? Whether it's, we talked about the principles and governance, having a clear articulation of what is our, in the case of AI, what is our responsible AI principles? What are the definitions of it? And how does it align with my overall corporate strategy is extremely, extremely critical. But then not just keep it at the assessment and definition phase, but then crystallize that with leadership action by evangelizing that and, kind of orchestrating that across the entire enterprise from the top leadership, saying this is what responsible AI means for us and how it is a strategic imperative for the future of our company, for our customers, for our entire ecosystem of value chain partners. And then figuring out a way to constantly measure the company's strategy and its evolution with respect to use responsible AI principles. And then taking it one step further, and institutionalizing that into the policies and the controls that are being put in place to assess the gaps, with respect to the point that Danielle was making about platforms, right? What are some of the gaps with respect to the controls and the policies, that are in place? Can we start creating, more automation or semi-automation with human in the loop to start monitoring on a regular basis, with respect to our compliance against those, protocols, right? And if we are seeing some aberrations, right, how can we actually intervene in between to make adaptations both ways for the tech platform, but also for the policies which might need to get adapted, and how can we establish a feedback loop in between, right, with all those learnings? I think is going to become extremely critical. And then the element that I want to highlight is around the bias, the bias that starts coming in, and how can we start creating a robust technology-enabled approach in assessing the fairness, that both in the data that is coming in, and something that Emily talked about, there is a lot of historic bias that can come in the data, and that can perpetuate into the AI models that are making the decisions. how do you actually find a mechanism of clubbing that at the beginning itself, so that you don't perpetuate the AI models? And at the same time, as your AI models are being built, how do you have a framework in ongoing monitoring of the AI models, the performance of the models? If there is decaying and drift in the AI models, how can you actually measure that and again do proactive interventions to correct that? That becomes extremely critical. And just to give you an example, many times we actually do a lot of data sanitization. For example, okay, we want to prevent gender bias, so we have taken out variables that are related to gender. But unknowingly, there might be data that is there around employment history. And sometimes we know that these are proxy attributes that can start creating inherent biases around gender disequality, if you will, right? How can you start identifying those proxy variables and take into account from your data quality perspective? So just wanted to share that example. And then finally, it's about the talent and the skills, right? How can we assess the readiness of our talent with respect to understanding responsible AI? And how can we actually create new skilling programs for the talent within our organization across our ecosystem, so their overall AI acumen can actually improve and they can speak the same language? And just to bring it to life, I take an example from a financial services banking industry. We work with one of the large European banks, and they were creating digital solutions to drive personalization at scale for their customers. And we had the opportunity of partnering with them to define their entire AI principles for their personalization digital agenda, and then translating that back to the understanding the algorithmic biases that might be coming in, and how to measure that, how to establish the right parameters, the thresholds, and more importantly, as we establish those algorithmic biases principles and models, it started creating more explainability and more transparency around their AI models. And that helped them to also answer a lot of the questions with the regulators. And now they're taking that approach, obviously creating more trust-based, fair decisions with their end customers, creating better customer experiences, but now taking it into other dimensions like anti-money laundering, KYC, fraud management. The similar principles are being taken across the entire value chain of the banking sector in the case of the banking client in the Europe. So just wanted to bring that to life and share some of these solution principles and how that can really help us create scaled AI solutions and scaled AI impact.
Yeah, thank you so much, Arnab. I really, I was taking notes during your response, and I really pulled out elements of the policy and leadership buy-in in ecosystem that is necessary to make AI fairness a reality. Also, measurement and evaluation and intervention, creating systems to be able to put that into action as part of regular processes. And then finally, debiasing, not only from the point of the creation and the implementation of algorithms, but also from staffing, something that is very central to the program that I'm currently working on, the Tech Equity Accountability Mechanism, is how do we make sure that we're creating pipelines, or should I say pathways of staff that are not only taking just standard 101 DEI trainings, but actually looking deeply into what product inclusion looks like, and creating systems and processes to ensure that our practitioners, our tech workers are informed about bias and ethics and ways to include that in their work to create more equitable products as a result. I'd love to hand this over to Daniel to talk a little bit of the work at the ADL.
Sure. So in terms of the solutions that we're looking at, I think one of the so we have sort of a 6-part sort of framework for addressing hate on the internet, which we call our repair framework. I'll spare you the acronym for now, but I'll focus on sort of 2 elements for now, which is one of them, the E in repair, is for exposing platform recklessness, and the A is advocate for targets of online hate and harassment. So when we're talking about exposing platform recklessness, we're talking really here about transparency, and when we're talking about advocating for targets of online hate and harassment, we're talking about making sure that we are raising up the voices of those communities that are most impacted. And so we do this in a couple different ways. One of the ways we do this is we do 2 nationally representative surveys, which look at one of the problems that I raised earlier, which is around, how much hate is there online? So we do a survey of social media, and we do a survey of online multiplayer games, looking at both as digital social spaces where hate and harassment manifest. This past year, we found that 47% of adults were experienced any form of online harassment in social media spaces. 25% experienced severe harassment. So that's physical threats, sustained harassment, stalking, sexual harassment, those kinds of things. When we're talking about online multiplayer games, they're about 10 years behind social media in terms of the ways in which they're addressing the content. So in the past year, it's gone up year over year since we started this in 2019, but 83% of adults experienced harassment in online multiplayer games, and 71% experienced severe harassment of the types that I mentioned before, right? And so I think this is sort of one way in which we look at and trying to get our arms around, how big is this problem? Is anything that the companies, are the steps that the companies taking, making a big difference in terms of the numbers we're seeing, in terms of people who are experiencing this and the ways in which they are expressing themselves through this. A survey has limits, as Emily mentioned, but I think this is sort of a way to start getting our arms around the kinds of harms that are happening in these spaces. Another way in which we are looking at this sort of issue is by doing and looking at the development of AI and machine learning tools with the targeted communities sort of at the center of that. So I think it was last year, there was a huge leak of Facebook documents by the whistleblower Frances Haugen. And one of the quotes they mentioned, they talk about how they train machine learning models, right? Essentially, they take a whole bunch of data and they have a bunch of people online code them as hate or not hate. Right, and the quote from the leak was essentially, is not doing, it's never going to make much of a dent, is what this says, right? And so what we've been doing over the last year is really looking at, okay, how do we create a machine learning model that centers the experience of targeted communities? So we have been developing a machine learning model that takes, that focuses on anti-Semitism, right? And that is about Jewish people taking the experience of anti-Semitism that they see online and labeling the data as either anti-Semitism or not, based on their experience, and then using that data to feed the classifier and train it, right? This is a model that we think could be used by other impacted communities as well. And so it's a start of a process whereby we're saying, okay, what does it actually mean to put the targeted communities in the center of creating these technologies? Not just, when you hear a lot of talk about content moderation and the need to have people with different sort of language and cultural backgrounds reviewing the content once it's flagged. But I think another piece of this is really centering those communities in the creation of the technology as well. So those are the kind of things that I would highlight in terms of some solutions that we're exploring. And I will turn it back to you. I'm happy to talk more about any of this.
Yeah, thank you so much. And wow, those numbers were a lot. I was not expecting them to be that high. You said, 47% of adults, that's almost half of our online population on social media experiences harm. And, I can't imagine, the 83% that you mentioned on multiplayer games, that is, that's a significant part of the culture. And wow, thank you so much for sharing that. And definitely resonating strongly with the idea of making sure that communities are at the center of the technologies that they engage with and that affect them. I want to hand it over to Emily to talk about her work as well.
Sure. Thank you, Shreya. And thank you to my co-panelists. I'm sure I'm going to echo a lot of what you've already said. But from AJC's perspective, again, we're speaking from Asian American populations and communities and all of our diverse communities. So when we are working with companies, it is a lot of what Daniel has already mentioned. We want to make sure that it is community-focused, user-focused, people-centered, and we're thinking about the needs, challenges, and potential harms that could be brought on marginalized communities from the very beginning of ideation and product creation. At every single step of a company's process, it should be embedded rather than layered on top as like a afterthought or like regulatory enforcement thing that happens retroactively. We really need that value of like the humanness and the effect it will have on society to be front and center at every stage. And I'll add that it's not just user research, right? Like we are seeing some progress, which is really encouraging, where there is this awareness, okay, users have to be diverse, they have to be from different walks and of life and different community backgrounds to make sure we're designing for a broader audience. And that's kind of easy because that's in a company's interest too, right? Because they're increasing their market of users. But it's really important that they also think about how their products and features are affecting non-users and society at large, because even though they might not be direct customers or clients, they are inevitably harmed, or their lives are just changed neutrally or whatever it is, maybe for better even, by the technology, regardless of whether or not they are engaging in it directly. So surveillance is a great and privacy is a great example of this. Now, because we live in a world where everyone has cameras and mics on them all the time, I might not engage in an application that I know isn't great on privacy. But if someone in my household does use that application and shares information about themselves, my data is inevitably now tied in, even if I'm not engaged, right? My family members who don't speak English, their data is included, even though they have no idea what this app is or what it does or what it collects about them. So really, who is in the entire ecosystem, even if they're not engaging directly with you? It's really important to understand, at this point, and looking historically, what is the lived experience of these communities? What type of forces have pushed them in certain ways? How do we minimize the harms that are going to be perpetuated inevitably, right? Because these tech companies are embedded in society. It's not 100% their fault either, but they need to understand the world they're entering and the effect that they will have, because they are responsible for how they either reduce that harm or increase it. And in many of these instances, unfortunately, we've seen they are increasing the societal harms and amplifying them. So how do we do this? Number one, this was already brought up, and I'm glad to hear Accenture is thinking about this already, but hiring diverse workers who come from different communities and are able to bring their lived experiences, their communities, their families with them when they walk into the door, right? They're hired because they bring value, not because of just their technical skills, but because of the lived experiences and communities they bring in with them. So we should be more inclusive from who we hire at every single level, every layer, every team of the company, because each and every team has some kind of decision making that will impact the community, and there has to be some community representation there. I'll also add that, we know it's not possible to have the perfect group of people from every community. So education and training is essential. So all teams at all levels and disciplines should all have to be required to understand the societies, the countries, the markets, the individual communities and users that they're going to be interacting with, and understand how their day-to-day is going to impact the lived experiences of real people on the ground. And that needs to be constantly iterative for every new issue, every new controversy that comes up. That they're going to have a hand in impacting. And then I'll also add data disaggregation and contextualization of the data is really important. So whenever we're using data to inform the decisions that are going to be made by machines, for example, who collected that data, when was it collected by, for what purpose, and what was it used for? And also, I think we have to talk about, it should be people-centered, it should be community-focused, but also when is it just not appropriate to include our community members and their data in the products we're making, because it's not going to be a positive thing for them, right? At what point do we say, we should refrain from collecting as much data we should have and only collect what is absolutely necessary to actually provide this service? Because we know that it's not always in our interest to have all of our data included in these systems, especially if there isn't as much transparency, and especially if our communities are vulnerable and that data can be weaponized against them. So always making sure that it actually serves our communities to be included and stopping when it's not appropriate. And then the last thing I'll say is, we already talked about this with our different panelists, but the importance of transparency and accountability. So it's not enough to have one DEI initiative. It's not enough to have one privacy opt-out tool. This really has to be an iterative process where there's accountability, right? We understand the impact of your interventions. We understand the impact of your DEI initiatives, increasing diversity, and constantly go back to it in consultation with community to constantly understand how the decisions tech companies are making are impacting our communities. And it has to be an open pipeline of communication that's constant and built in with accountability so that we know that they actually are listening and making the changes that our communities are demanding.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. You've definitely given me a lot to think about. I've been taking notes as well. And I have had the honor of seeing you in action and seeing you, put forth these recommendations in place. And just one thing that I wrote down was we have to start thinking about how products and features are affecting non-users and truly thinking about the negative externalities of these products and their impacts on people that they may not even be thinking about in the ecosystem. That is so important. I think I really want to wrap it up and mention an example from my own experience. As was mentioned earlier, I am currently at the Aspen Institute at Aspen Digital, a policy program of the Aspen Institute, working on a team called the Tech Equity Accountability Mechanism, or TEAM, where we are looking at creating systems of accountability for the tech industry at large, from people to pathways to tech companies and tech roles, especially in these hard, software engineering and AI positions, to belonging and making sure that is a space where people feel welcome, to product inclusion and ensuring that while we're working on this long-term challenge of staff representation and making sure tech workers are representative of all societies that they belong to, that we're also creating systems and processes and checks for products to go through to ensure that they are equitable in their impact. I wanted to bring up, because we are a convener and it is my honor to bring together people, much like Emily in previous conversations, somebody who I had the honor of engaging with earlier, who provides an opportunity in this space, and that is Michael Runningwolf. He is a software engineer and runs a coding camp for Indigenous youth, and really is doing amazing work in making sure that artificial intelligence is used to increase the preservation of Native and Indigenous languages. And I wanted to close out this conversation with a mention of his work, because it really provides an opportunity to look at where AI can go in the preservation of our cultures and in serving our communities in a really authentic way, driven by people from the community, and creating those pipelines and strengthening those. So I just wanted to bring his name in this space, and also thank all of our wonderful panelists here gathered today. I've definitely been taking copious notes, and this has been such an inspiring and eye-opening panel. I hope all of the watchers of this panel feel the same. And I just wanted to give a big thank you for my invitation and for the company that you have been providing. Thank you to APAICS and all to the organizers of this event.
Thank you.
And thank you, Shreya, for facilitating a great conversation. I certainly learned a lot as well.